Good morning, one and all. Before we commence with the session, I request all the participants to adhere to the following instructions. Kindly mute the audio and video. The session will be conducted on Google Meet platform and will be streamed live on YouTube. Participants are requested to post their questions in the chat box well in advance along with their name and details. Further, the question and answer session will be monitored by the coordinator and the feasibility of time will be the deciding factor to limit the discussion. To obtain e-certificates, participants are requested to fill in the feedback form. The link will be shared in the WhatsApp group only after the session. Please do not post requests asking for the same. I repeat, the link will be shared only at the end of the session. Warm greetings to all the participants. On behalf of the Department of English and IQAC of SPRR Mahajana First Grade College, Mysuru, I, Purnima, member of IQAC and NAC committee, extend a cordial welcome to all on the occasion of the national webinar, Theoretical Paradigm in English Literary Studies. Two eminent professors with distinguished academic credentials, Dr. Vijay Sheshadri and Dr. Krishna Manavalli, will share insightful observations during the course of the webinar. Literary theory is an unavoidable part of studying literature and criticism. Theory, when it takes the form of isms, can be often intimidating and, frankly speaking, boring. Terry Eagleton, in the preface to his book, Literary Theory, clearly expresses that the purpose of book is to help demystify those who fear the subjects of literary theory in beyond their realm. Today's webinar has been organized with this fond hope that it will make the literary criticism terrain more familiar. With these words, may I request our principal, Dr. B.R. Jaikumari, to share few words about the college and the objectives of the program. I am glad to bring to your attention that Madam is an ardent student of literature. She has obtained her PhD degree in Kannada literature. Over to you, ma'am. Ma'am, please.
Good morning. I extend a hearty welcome to all of you to this national webinar hosted by the Department of English along with IQAC on the topic Theoretical Paradigm in English Literary Studies. On this occasion, I am glad to share a few words about our college, Mahajana College. SPRR Mahajana First Grade College has been continually striving for the holistic development of the students in its journey of 37 years. It started as a women's college in year 1982 and became a grantinate institution in this year 1987. In 1988, the college became a co-educational institution and then went to offer different courses. In the year 1999, it established the Postgraduate Center. With 34 departments under its umbrella, the college has been active in this field of higher education. The college has raised its bar by this successfully facing contemporary challenges in this field of higher education, while consciously dedicating itself to construct a healthy society. The college has to be its credit of being the first institution among the affiliated colleges of University of Mysore to be accredited by NAC with 4th star in the year 2001. It was re-accredited in 2007 with B++ grade and A grade in the year 2015. In a survey conducted by the Education World in April 2020, our college was recognized as the 16th best college in Karnataka and obtained 77 ranking at the national level. Various platforms like NCC, NSS, sports, cultural, and many other ASIC fora in the college help students involved actively in co-curricular activities. Those activities help them development their overall personality by being the creative and also enhance their self capability. It is matter of pride to mention the College of Fields blessed with his visit of former President Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, Nobel Prize winner Professor Muhammad Yunus, Salumarada Timmaka, Jnanapita awardees Professor U.R. Anantamurthy, Dr. Chandrasekhar Kambara, and a host of others. Presently, we are involved in this preparation for the fourth cycle of accreditations by NAC. As part of our continuous engagement with academics, various departments are hosting webinars. Literature has been relevant at all times. Even during a pandemic crisis like COVID-19, reading has been a comforting factor. However, on a professional for reading literatures requires a certain training is enhanced one's understanding of a wide range of cultural and intellectual traditions. From this perspectives, I do hope today's webinar will be benefit the teaching community. I congratulate the Department of English on its initiative. I thank the resource person, Dr. Vijay Sheshadri and Dr. Krishna Manavalli, who is be sharing their keen insights on the topic. I thank you all the participants and wish the webinar a success. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I now request Ms. Geeta, Assistant Professor, Department of English, to welcome and introduce the resource person. Madam, please.
Good morning to one and all. We are certainly overwhelmed by the good number of participants from various colleges across the length and breadth of the country. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual session. It's my privilege to introduce and welcome our first speaker, Professor Vijay Sheshadri, who will be speaking on the topic Cartographing the Modern Literary Theory. Dr. Vijay Sheshadri is presently working as Professor of English with a vast experience of 3 decades. He is also the director of Sir M. Vishveshwaraya Postgraduate Center of the University of Mysore at Mandya and the coordinator of Center for Canadian Studies set up at the Department of English, University of Mysore. A brilliant student of the University of Mysore, Professor Sheshadri obtained second rank in MA English and was also awarded doctorate degree for his thesis on Margaret Lawrence and Shashi Deshpande, a study of the notion of marginal woman in Canadian and Indian fiction in English in the year 1999. 12 book reviews, 31 articles in journals of international repute, 76 presentations in conferences, seminars and workshops, and to mention specifically, international presentations on invitation at Innsbruck University, Austria in the year 2013 and Algoma University, Canada in the year 2012 speak of his excellence as an academician. Professor has successfully guided 8 PhD students and 4 MPhil students. At present, 8 students are lucky enough to pursue their PhD degree under his guidance. He has been a member of BOS, Board of Studies and Board of Examination of various universities in the country. The writings and translations of Vijay Sir speak of his varied interest. Savoring the Maple, critical essays on the Canadian novel, Beyond the Walls, Women in the Novels of Margaret Lawrence and Shashi Deshpande are 2 of his books. Among his translations, I must mention Veerappa Moili's Sri Ramayana Mahan Veshanam, Book 5 from the Kannada original with the same title by Veerappa Moili. a book on folk narratives of Karnataka, and a book on Vachanas, both translations from Kannada are in press. It is but natural that recognition should follow. Mention must be made of visit to Canada on Shastri Indo-Canadian Faculty Enrichment Award in the year 2005-6. Mysore University Golden Jubilee Foundation Sri Krishna Rajendra Wadeyar Award for the book Beyond the Walls. Consolation Prize for Poetry Translation from the Sahitya Academy, New Delhi in 2008. Before I wind up, I must bring to the attention of this august gathering Sir's keen interest in the game of lawn tennis. He has donned the university colors as a student, captained the team, and has won several district and state level tournaments. I do hope, sir, I have done justice to the immense credentials of the distinguished speaker. I must place on record Sir's willingness to guide the department in organizing events of this nature. And this time, too, it was no exception. In fact, he helped us shape this whole event. Thank you, sir, but more to it later during the vote of thanks. Sir, I extend a warm welcome to you on behalf of all of us who are part of the webinar. Sir, may I request you to take over?
Very good morning to all of you. At the outset, I thank the Department of English, Mahajanas College, for organizing this webinar on theoretical paradigms in English literary studies. At the same time, I also thank the college administration for extending their invitation to me to speak on this occasion. I will not take much time. I'll just straight away go to the uh, paper, which uh, roughly around 40 minutes of breezing through, rather, the various theoretical posits, and then we can have an interactive session. Well, before I go into this topic, cartographing modern literary theory, I would like to first start with a sort of a caveat as to why we, as students of literature, we need to study or know about theories. This is one of the major, issues that has been debated and brought to my notice from many of my students teaching in the university for over the past 30 years. Because their complaint is that all these theories are of not any use in a classroom situation where you people teach language. That's the complaint. But all said and done, I still advise you people to have a look at these theories, essentially because it will help you to see and have a fresh look at the creative works, any form of creative activity, simply because these theories will sharpen your mind. At the same time, the caveat is that these theories, one should be very judicious enough to make use of these theories, simply for the fact that most of these theories sometimes do not, come into play at all on many occasions. Hence, it depends on the student of literary studies whether using a particular theoretical framework, does it really help a student to understand a literary text in a better way, or helps him or her to read a literary text in a better fashion. All said and done, if you do not want a theory at all, again, you are yourself posing a theory that you are anti-theory, not anti-theory, but you don't want a theory. So theory is just like the COVID-19 virus. Whether you like it or not, it is going to stay with us, and we have to bear with it, and we have to, live along with it, being students of English literary studies. Now, what I try to do in this short sort of breezing through, skimming through the various critical theories is this: that I will start from Russian formalism along with neo-criticism, and then I will move almost to the end of phenomenology, so that at least the purpose here is not to delve deep into each theoretical framework because of the paucity of time, but the salient features and the crucial aspects of the particular posits that each literary theory puts across will be touched upon, so that it'll at least, this is what the one of the organizers emphasized on, that you need to make theory as simple as possible, so that teachers teaching in rural colleges at least will have an idea of what these theories are all about. So this is what I have attempted. I hope I will be successful and convincing in what I have done. Now, I begin my talk with this question of what is literature. There are certain important quotations because the famous adage being literature matters because life matters. Hence, you need literature in order to keep your spirits up, in order to refine your mind, in order to be in the world, in order to know what you are. You know, I am reminded of Matthew Arnold, who said that mankind will discover that we have to turn to poetry to interpret life for us, to sustain, because poetry, you know, in poetry, our race, as time goes on, will find an ever surer and surer stay. At the same time, you have Richards, I.A. Richards, talking about this, that arts are our storehouse of recorded values. And the New Bold Report of 1921 talking about literature not as just an academic discipline, but a temple of human spirit. And then Roman Jakobson giving a totally different view on literature, where he says literature represents an organized violence committed on ordinary speech. And Terry Eagleton talking about literature as something that you know, thrusts on us to see the dramatic power of language, and refreshing our habitual responses, and presenting the objects more perceptible. So these are some of the observations on literature in general by well-known literary figures, right from 18, a fag end of 18th century to the 20th century. Now, what is the function and operation of literature? This is very important for us, because through language, literature helps us to see ourselves in a more self-conscious way than the usual way. By making us more self-conscious and enabling us to see things in a very serious, meticulous fashion, literature helps us to see the world in a renewed fashion through literary language. In other words, broadly, you can say that literature is a non-pragmatic prose. The kind of literary language we come across in the literary texts are not seen in everyday today conversation or language. We have this famous example of love's like a red, red rose, or Faustus's famous line of on Helen. Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of the Ilium? So you can see, if you examine these kind of usage of language, that literature, you know, here operates as a self-referential language, and which talks about itself. For example, to make it more simple, we say the Mysore Palace was completed in 1912. This just becomes a statement. But if you give the same statement in the hands of a literary figure, he would put it this way: the Mysore Palace is a wonder specimen of Indo-Sasanic literature or architecture. So this is how the literary language operates. Now, coming to the theoretical part. Now, there are basically four approaches to the study of literature. Now, the first one is a textual approach. The second one is author-centered approach. The third one is, on the reader-centric approach. And the fourth one is context-based. Now, in the textual approach, you have various theoretical posits like philology, rhetoric, formalism, structuralism, new criticism, semiotics, deconstruction. In the author-centered or author-centric approach, you have biographical approach, you have psychoanalytical approach, and then the phenomenological approach. In the reader-oriented approach, you have reception theory, you have reception history, and reader response theory. Then in the fourth context-based approach, you have the basic use of literary history, the Marxist literary history, the feminist literary theory, new historicism, and cultural studies. So these are basically the broad four approaches to the study of literature, theoretical approaches. Now I move on to the difference between criticism and theory. Now we all know that any form of reading itself can be an interpretation, or it definitely involves some sort of interpretation. So the word criticism, and we know, is borrowed from the word kritikos, means judgment, to evaluate a certain object which the reader comes across. Now, there are many forms of criticism, but the major would be interpretative criticism, biographical criticism, judicial criticism, or legislative criticism, and so forth. Now, it is essential for us as students of literature to know the difference between what is criticism and what is theory. Now, theory poses questions for other pursuits, whereas criticism is just an attempt to evaluate. Now, for example, any theory for that matter, it analyzes the philosophical and methodological premises of literary criticism itself. In other words, theory sheds light on the very method used in reading a particular work of art. So let me make it very clear. Theory analyzes the philosophical and methodological premises of literary criticism. And theory sheds light on the very method used in the literary reading of a creative work or a literary piece. Now, for example, if a criticism or a critical approach talks about, say, for example, it says the narrative twist is a very effective thing in the novel, the theoretical approach would be, what is narrative first? And then we talk about how the narrative has taken a twist. This is what theory does. Now, if criticism talks about, say, Carl Jung's patterns in a novel, in a psychological approach or criticism, theory, for example, questions first, what is a novel? What is the difference between a novel in the conventional sense? What is the difference between a psychological novel and a literary novel? So this is the difference between criticism and theory. Now, why should we read literary theory? Because in today's context, literature has undergone a lot of change. Now, the modern literary theory begins with Russian formalist Viktor Sholsky's essay, Art as Desire. And I will talk about formalism shortly. Why we need literary theory? Simply because it not just provides us a new method for study of literary works. At the same time, it also questions the nature and function of literature and literary institutions. This is why theory is essential. In criticism, we just simply make a judgment. It's an interpretation. We say the novel deals with this and novel deals with that. Whereas in a literary theoretical approach, what we do is we go to the premise of that literary critical approach, in the sense that what is the study of literary works and what is the nature of it, what is the function of literature and literary institution. For example, see, if we are studying Marxism, you can't study Marxism as a variant of sociology. It will be a big mistake on the part of us if we are studying Marxism as a variation of sociology. Instead of looking at that in that fashion, we have to look at Marxism as a very critique of the concept of sociology. If we develop this approach, even our syllabus will change, and most of the students of English literary studies will be benefited by such an approach. Because if we look at Marxism as a variant of sociology, it is a conceptual mistake we are making, and it's crucial for teachers of English literary studies or English literature to avoid such conceptual mistakes, so that the problem with us is we have this habit of putting incomparable things together. If you look at the syllabus, you study one poet from medieval age, another one, especially at the undergraduate level, especially in a language syllabus. Hence, reading theories will alert us to this problem, and we will avoid such conceptual mistakes. Now, what are the effects of literary theory? Now, literary theory critiques the common sense notions and shows how it is a historical construction. Literary theory looks at writing as just an expression. And literary theory does not say the truth exists in that writing. The truth lies somewhere else. It's not there in that writing. What we see there as truth is just context bound. In other words, since it is context bound, we are saying that reality is what is present at a given point of time. That is the reason why when we read a novel today, and when what we have understood today will not be the same if we read the novel after 25 days or 30 days. Simply because reality that was present today is totally different when we read, on a different day. This is simply because reality is not there perpetually present all the time. It is present in the sense that in a different degree, in lots of variations. So literary theory, it questions the most basic premise or assumptions of literary study. For example, what is meaning? What is an author? Who is an author? What is the act of reading? What does it involve? For example, Michel Foucault's views on sex, Derrida's views on writing. Now, these are the theoretical approaches we have. Now, in English literary studies, we have especially in the English and the American literary studies, these are the two major theoretical posits we have. We have practical criticism operating in UK and new criticism operating in the United States of America. So this is the kind of preamble which I had in mind before I go into the various aspects of theoretical approaches. Now, I will start with a new criticism, which is basically, which basically emerged from the formalist movement. It's an alternative form of literary analysis. Now, close reading is one of the prominent features of new criticism, especially reading of poetry. And new criticism enables us to see any literary piece as a self-contained object. In other words, new criticism focuses on the aesthetics of the work, and what it says is there's no need to know the author's intention, historical and cultural context, political context, and the moralist bias in analyzing literature. So the focus is more on what is said and how it is written in a new critical approach. Now, in formalism, for that matter, uh, it is from where a new criticism emerged, influenced by that. Now, according to formalism, which started in 1914 and uh, came up to 1960s till the early structuralism, formalism orients itself to the form of literature. The purpose of art, according to a formalist, is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. This is the famous statement of Victor Solsky. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. Now, this is what we, call the process of defamiliarization. Now, this process of defamiliarization takes place simply because of the literariness that is operating in a work of art, according to the formalist. Now, what produces this defamiliarization process? Now, according to the formalist, defamiliarization process is there. It happens because of the literariness of the work of art. Now, this is because there are two concepts associated with this. One is the fabula, the other one is the sujet. Now, fabula is the actually told story. Sujet is how the story is told. In other words, the difference lies in presentation and not in the content. The content is the same, whereas the presentation of it totally changes. Because of this, the defamiliarization process takes place. Now, if you want to know how this operates, you can see Vladimir Prop's Morphology of a Folktale, or A.K. Ramanujan's views on Ramayanas, or Paula Wichmann's 300 Ramayanas, where you have versions of Ramayanas available, and the content is the same, whereas the presentation is, totally different. Now, defamiliarization is because of the literariness that one finds in a work of art, according to Russian formalists. Now, structuralism, which is an extension of formalism, but with a lot of change, it emerged during the 1920s. And Roman Jakobson is one who is very much part of this early structuralism, which is also called the Prague structuralism. Now, for these early structuralists, literary text is a structure wherein all the elements are interrelated and interdependent. Literary text, for that matter, you cannot read a literary text in isolation. The other aspect is a literary text, the function of a literary text is determined by its orientation. This is very important in early structuralism. What the early structuralists emphasized was on the orientation of the text. What is this orientation? Every text has a message, every text has a focus, and the focus should be on the message given by the text. In other words, the focus should be on the message sent by the sender and not on any other target. Not on the sender, but on the message sent by him. Hence, according to structuralists, literary text has more than one function and orientation simultaneously. So this is the difference between Russian formalist approach and a structuralist approach. So the difference is structuralists have replaced the word defamiliarization of formalists with the word foregrounding. Now, what do you foreground? You are foregrounding an utterance, that is the message that is sent by the text. Now, foregrounding emphasizes on the dynamism of the relationship. Okay? In other words, defamiliarization talks about the contrastive and static relationship between defamiliarizing element and other elements, whereas foregrounding emphasizes the dynamism of that relationship. In other words, literariness or aesthetic function of art is a fine combination or an equivalence of axis of selection and axis of combination. This is what gives us the structure and meaning of a literary text. I have tried to simplify it as simple as possible. Now, the early structuralism emphasized on this process of foregrounding, whereas the French structuralists, uh, you know, the principal propounder of this is Ferdinand de Saussure, whose theory of the study of language is used. The concepts like parole, which is an individual utterance, lang, which is a set of rules on how language as such works, and what is the link between a word and what it refers, the link between the word and the object that it is referring to is simply arbitrary according to French structuralism. This is because two concepts are always operating. One is the signifier, that is the word as it is spoken or written, and signified is the meaning. It's a human category, a concept. So reality is determined by the language, and this reality is called linguistic determinism according to the French structuralists. Now, and as an extension of this structuralism, we move into the anthropological structuralism. The propounder of this is Claude Lévi-Strauss in the 1940s. The shift is from language to the study of cultures. According to the structural anthropologists, the most diverse myth with no connection can be seen as variations upon one and the same basic pattern. Everything that has a cultural origin, according to anthropologists, is not biologically determined. For example, eating customs, taboos, rules of preparing food, kinship, etc. Now, what the anthropological structuralism emphasizes is on this. The basic mental orientations or operations consist in the creation of opposites, that is, binary oppositions. And the famous practitioners of this is literary structuralism is Todorov, Bremont, Gerard Genet, and so forth. Now, they focus predominantly on how this basic mental operations, which has this binary opposites working all the time. They focused it on predominantly on narratives. Now, this is what I had to say about structuralism because I can't go deep into this. I don't have much time. What is the time left for me? 5 to 10 minutes. Okay. Now I move on to post-structuralism and deconstruction, and the most popular name, of course, is Derrida, and most of you know of Derrida's views. What he says is the West is logocentric, and Derrida attacks the notion that language is not basically, as we all think, the vehicle of truth. He says language is inherently unreliable and it operates on the basic differentiation. So the word which is spoken is not the true present. Earlier we had talked about this, that reality exists, but it exists in a different way at different point of time. The same extension you can see in Derrida's observation on reality. And that's why he says language cannot be totally taken as something that talks about truth, because he says the truth that is present, or the true present rather, is you know not the word that talks about the true present is not the true present, simply because of the spacing and temporalization that intervenes. That's why he uses the word differ and defer. And these are some of the important things which Derrida talks about. Now, his method of deconstruction should not be mistaken for destruction. What Derrida does through his deconstruction is he decenters. In other words, he says knowledge is, not operating from a center. In other words, the center is not there at all. The center is always elusive. Now, the centering operations is a false coherence. In other words, you people are given a notion of, look, this is the center, but that is actually not the center. You can't, in other words, to simplify it, to bring it to literature, what Derrida's deconstruction does to us as students of literature is to show that we cannot have a final meaning in any creative enterprise. So it doesn't mean to say that deconstructive mode of analysis is a dismantling of the structure of a text. But the irony of it is Derrida's deconstructive practice shows us that the text is already dismantled and given to us. So we think that it is not dismantled. This is where he says you can't have a impossibility to have a final meaning in any reading or understanding or interpretation. This is because the indeterminacy of a language is operating all the time. And we do not, because of this, we do not have a genuine understanding of our own self. The famous practitioners of deconstruction, apart from Derrida, Stuart Hall, Christopher Norris, Jonathan Culler, Roland Barthes, Paul Deman, to mention a few. After talking about formalism, structuralism, and deconstruction and post-structuralism, I move on to the archetypal and mythical approach, which is largely based on Jung and Joseph Campbell. And according to this archetypal or mythological approach, we have, the individual patterns of literature, especially realistic works. These are viewed as recurrences of certain archetypes and essential mythic formulae according to this approach. These archetypes are the primordial images. In other words, they are the psychic residue. It gets repeated in terms of experiences in the lives of people, especially from very ancient ancestors. And this is inherited, and the archetypes are inherited and got from what he talks about, Jung calls collective unconscious. That is, human race these are expressed in the form of myths, religion, dreams, private fantasies, as well as in the works of literature according to this approach. For example, the white color, it could give you the impression of innocence, or it can also talk about the supernatural aspect. And you have this famous force, season, summer, spring, autumn, winter, signifying the four stages of human cycle: birth, youth, old age, and death. This is the approach you have in archetypal and mythological approach. Psychoanalytical, which is basically borrowed from Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan, and to study literature. And this approach, in psychoanalytical approach, the focus is on the writer's psyche, the creative process, the psychological types, and the principles present within works of literature, or the effects of literature upon its readers. Um, you can also read Jung's Psychology and Literature, a very well-known essay which talks about the difference between a psychological novel and a conventional novel. Now, the psychological approach is based on Freud's concept of id, ego, and superego, as well as Lacan's imaginary, symbolic, and the real aspects. Now, id, ego, and superego, most of the psychologists students will know these are the basic elementary aspects. Id is the storer of our desires, a psychosexual energy. Now, ego is the conscious part of the psyche, which operates as a mediator between the id and the superego. Superego is an external agency or one's own conscience, which throws light on the moral judgments because of the social pressures that operate on the individual psyche. Of course, since it's a very broad area to cartograph, I'll just quickly take you to postmodernism, under which there are certain important theoretical posits. Now, postmodernism, as you all know, it's a powerful movement of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It brought in it brought in a change in terms of approaching and understanding literature in the current century and the previous one. To put it in very simple terms, postmodern, the word is not simply related to a certain period or time. What we need to know about is the postmodern condition. That is, reality cannot be grasped in totality. In other words, it's a very apolitical, elusive, self-absorbing, term, which defies any specific what we call pakka definition. It's not possible because we are, as it is, living in a world of hyper-reality according to the postmodern condition. Simulacra, simulations, these are the terms that are normally used. Now, you have Lyotard, Baudrillard, Linda Hutcheon, Brian McHale, these are Frederick Jamison. These are some of the well-known practitioners of postmodernism or postmodern approaches. Now, you have, because of such a examination, you have concepts related to history percolated into literary studies, concepts like historicism, which is nothing but the relativizing of the past by getting to know the different interpretations to which it is open and deciding them on the grounds expressing our own contemporary situation. In other words, Historicism is an admixture of literary interpretation and historical explanation. Now, new historicism is something which is slightly an extension as well as different than historicism. Now, new historicism is a method of describing culture in action. This is a term coined by Stephen Greenblatt. He applied to a body of critical work on the English Renaissance. Now, it generally refers to new historicism, generally refers to the relationship between literature and history, directly or indirectly, it is influenced by post-structuralist theory. The focus of new historicists is on the synchronic and not on the diachronic. Hence, in any new historicist approach, literature constitutes not a body of work, but a set of texts and contexts. So that is historicism and new historicism. Of course, in Indian perspective, you have Itihasa, Purana, Sthala Purana, Katha traditions, of which you can compare and contrast and see how it is different when compared to historicism and the new historicism. Then you have Marxism, which is basically a sociological approach which use the works of literature or art as products of historical forces. This is very, very important. And you have to analyze a work of art basing on the material conditions in which the work of art was produced. So, for example, the worldview in a Marxist ideology is nothing but the articulations of the dominant class of a particular period. If, for example, you're talking about a novel from 20th century, it is the Marxist would always look at it as a work of art that is putting forth the dominant ideology of the dominant class. So various terminologies are used in Marxism and I'll just breeze through that: commodification, consumption, dialectical materialism, and material circumstances, reflexionism, superstructure, base. These are some of the terminologies that are used in Marxism. Then you have feminism, the various waves of feminism. But I would like to just mention this, that feminism is not anti-men. Feminism is nothing but a socio-political movement which essays a change, any form of expression, exploitation, any form of indifference in terms of class. That is what feminism resists. It doesn't approve of any form of exploitation. The purpose of feminism is to bring in an androgynous vision, or bring in an androgynous society. Then you have various theories associated with extension of feminism, where you talk about gender, class, race, sexuality, queer theory. Then you have in queer theory, in talking about the question of identity, how reality is a traditional construction of reality, and heterosexual forms a site for subverting hegemonic power. These are some of the things that have emerged out of queer theory. Cross-dressing views gender as a theatricality, drag views femininity as a role, as a performance. So these are some of the important things that have emerged because of feminism. You have gender studies, and even gender studies departments talk about it. Post-colonialism, I will not talk about it because my friend Krishna will be talking about exhaustively in the next session. Of course, I would just briefly talk about post-colonialism is nothing but an attempt at reevaluating the Western concept of itself, adopt, adapt, and adapt. These are the phases in post-colonial writing, according to Peter Barry. And post-colonial approach ushers in contrapuntal reading. It examines the process of cultural displacement and the fashion in which the displaced have defended themselves. Alterity, diaspora, Eurocentrism, hybridity, imperialism, these are some of the terminologies which are part of post-colonial discourse. Then you have phenomenology, where you have Edmund Husserl, who proposed this phenomenological reduction. He is of the view that um, everything that is not imminent to consciousness must be excluded. He says all realities must be treated as a pure phenomenon. So, according to phenomenologist approach, art is not a means of securing pleasure, but a revelation of being. This is very important. Art is not a means of securing pleasure, but revelation of being. The work is the phenomenon by which we come to know the world. This is what a phenomenologist would say, reading a work of art. Now, to hermeneutics. Now, hermeneutics views interpretation as a circular process where you have a chance to arrive at a valid interpretation, because according to the hermeneutical approach, there is an interplay between the progressive sense of the whole and our retrospective understanding of the component parts of it. For example, E.D. Hirsch, who is of the view that he says a valid interpretation is possible by uncovering the work's authorial intent, though informed by historical and cultural determinants. Then you have Martin Heidegger, who says a reader must experience the inner life of the text in order to understand it all. In other words, a hermeneutical approach shows the place, the place of the reader, that this is what it is, being in the world, which is called dasein. So this is how I would come to the close of my talk. These are some of my concluding remarks. Now, I have just skimmed through the various literary theories. Because of the paucity of time, I couldn't go deep into each one, which of course Krishna would do. This is what we planned, and I would just simply skim through all the various majority of the popular literary theories, so that the other person would talk exclusively on one particular approach, so that at least it would bring in some kind of a wholeness to this webinar. Now, these are my concluding remarks. Literary theory, in my view, helps us to see what literary work means and what is their value. We know that pure or high theory is no longer in fashion today. And literary theory helps us to inquire into the very concept of canonicity, rather than supply the sophisticated methods for tackling canonical texts. As I said earlier, pure or high theory is no longer in fashion today. That's why we see many of the departments of English, especially at the postgraduate level, we don't talk about semiotics, don't talk about phenomenology, hermeneutics, post-structuralism. They have all gone into background, simply because, as philosophical currents, they don't stand in the departments, because probably the reason might be that these are, far these are at a distance, or these theoretical positions or philosophical currents, they do not form part of our daily life. Hence, probably they have gone to the background. But at the same time, you can also see that um, theories like psychoanalytical approach, post-colonialism, feminism, they are all on the rise. People talk, majority of the students who want to come and work for their PhD, they want to talk about post-colonialism. They want to talk about feminism. They want to talk about multiculturalism. They want to talk about sexual colonialism. Why? Why are these things, very popular? These are popular. They have not gone to the background simply because they are close to human experiences. Hence, they have become very popular. So, as I said earlier, COVID-19 virus is part and parcel of our life. We have to learn with it. The same way, as students of literature, whether you like theory or not, it is essential for us to know about theory, and then try and apply those theories as and when essential, very judiciously, so that you know we as students of literature will be in a better position to understand the value and uh, the use of literature in this commodified world. Thank you so much.
Can we take one or two quick questions?
Yeah, sure.
I have spoke about the language syllabus at PG level, the selections being ranked. What are your suggestions to address this issue? Because many number of colleges are becoming autonomous, and our college too is one. How do we address these issues?
See, as far as I am concerned, uh, having taught at the postgraduate level right from the beginning, I just taught 1 or 2 years at the undergraduate level. But still, I have found what we lack in the undergraduate um, syllabus pattern is the chronology. Because most of these students who come to postgraduate MA English course, they lack chronology. And in the very first class, we have to start with 1066 to the present. So it is because they will be spending more time with you people at the undergraduate level. For almost 3 years, they will be with you. So, at least for the optional English students, we have to give them a sense of chronology. From where it starts and where it ends and where it is moving towards. This is what I have observed, because as far as I am concerned, I've seen people choosing poems, poets, novels according to their whims and fancies. And if I'm very fond of Eliot, I'll prescribe 2 3 poems of it. And one of the teachers, the undergraduate level teaching in a rural college, asked me, "Sir, this year they have just prescribed poems on love." And some other, after 3 years, somebody says, "Sir, there are poems only on death." I said, well, how does it matter? What matters in how you teach? Both are essential. So what I probably have in mind, or you should have in mind, is that once we give the student at the undergraduate level a sense of chronology of, in other words, the literary history, if you give them the solid grounding in that, probably they will not have problems in, you know, taking it forward. So even choosing your text, you have to follow it, period wise. And sometimes you should also be bold enough to prescribe the most unpopular ones also.
So there's one question by Vishwanath. In what ways can gender be integrated in post-colonial literature?
Sorry?
In what ways can gender be interrogated post-colonial literature?
In what way?
What ways can gender be interrogated in post-colonial literature?
See, first of all, the question itself, I feel it is a bit flawed. Why are you calling this uh, aspect of this post-colonial literature and bringing it into this gender? First of all, because gender is gender. How gender was looked at in pre-colonial literature. So these are issues which one has to keep in mind, because gender, with the arrival of feminist theories, the French, the American, the Anglo, American, we can see that gender is a construct. Okay, so there is no post-colonial gender or a pre-colonial gender, in my view. I mean, this is my personal observation. For me, gender is a construct which needs to be deconstructed, whether it is post-colonial literature or English literature or Kannada literature. How are you deconstructing this notion of gender? See, gender can be viewed in two important perspectives. One is as a sociological aspect, the other one is from the linguistic perspective. The meaning that emerges and changes your approach to gender would be from the sociological perspective. Hence, for example, your gender construct depends on the way the roles you adopt to show what you are. For example, if I take a broom and sweep the floor, and my grandmother or my mother would say, "You should not do this. This is not good for the house." It is their view, but if I do the same thing, cleaning the house using a Euroclean, gender doesn't come into picture. So it's a construct. Hence, there is no post-colonial aspect attached to gender. In my view, as a student of literature, you have to look at how, under a particular point of time, this gender, the construct of gender has taken place. In that particular text or the situation. That is my observation.
So this question is by Kaveshri. Uh, how theories are adopted in cinemas?
How?
How theories are adopted in cinemas?
In
Movies.
Okay. See, I am not a movie buff, and I have not read film studies or theories. Theoretically, I do not know much about how theory is used in the visual medium. But you can talk about the gaze that emerges in gender studies or in feminism, where the lens, the eye of the camera is always male as far as movies are concerned. And it is time that you have to return the gaze. So this is how I would look at it. And probably Laura Mulvey's essay on the visual pleasure would help us to see how you can employ theories to understand movies. Even I think Professor Manu Chakravarti also has done some important analysis of movies using certain theories. So that is my response.
So one last
Yeah.
question. Which book will you suggest for us to better our understanding of literary theory?
Well, I would suggest any book that talks about theory, grab it and read it. I will not give you the whoever has asked this question. I will not give a ready-made, uh, uh, ready reckoner for that. Matt. There are many. There are like the beginning series, beginning theory, beginning postmodernism. These are essential at the initial phase of your understanding theory. Whereas there is no specific book. These are books just like I have just touched upon various things like essential for us. Then what interests you? You have to go into an in-depth study into that specific area so that you can master to a certain extent that particular theoretical concept.
Thank you, sir,
Yeah.
for taking the questions. With this, we come to the end of the first session. Okay, I request Madam Purnima.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for your bringing out the essential difference between criticism and theory, the four broad based approaches, and explaining the various theories in a simplified manner. Now I request Dr. Indrani, Assistant Professor, Department of English, to welcome and introduce Dr. Krishna Manavalli. Over to you, ma'am.
It gives me immense pleasure to welcome and introduce our second speaker for the session, Dr. Krishna Manavalli, who will be speaking on post-colonialism. Dr. Krishna Manavalli is currently professor in the Department of English at University of Mysore, having moved recently from Karnataka University, Dharwad. Professor is a literary critic and translator who works in both English and Kannada languages. In a long and brilliant academic career in the US and India, Dr. Krishna contemporary British literature, South Asian writing, post colonial studies, feminism, cultural studies, and translations. She also taught for many years in the US. Dr. Krishna has published internationally in important literary and cultural studies journals such as Comparative Critical Studies from UK, Journal of Contemporary Thought from USA and India, Studies in South Asian Film and Media, US, Proud Flesh, African Journal of Culture, and others. She presented at several major seminars and conferences across the world, including the American Comparative Literature Association and Harvard University, Carnegie Foundation for Advancement of Teaching, Texas, and Rocky Mountain MLA, Calgary in Canada. She has given talks at prestigious literary festivals in India like the Times Lit Fest, Bengaluru Literary Festival, Bangalore Poetry Festival, and Mysore Literary Festival, and the Sahitya Academy Festival of Letters. I remember vividly listening to Ma'am at the Mysore Literary Festival and in a translation book launch. In addition, Dr. Krishna does freelance writing, mainly literary reviews and interviews, for the Times of India, the Hindu, and the Indian Express. Apart from being a member of the English Advisory Board of the Central Sahitya Academy in New Delhi, Professor is one on many academic and university administrative boards in the state. Professor Krishna's recent publications include the translation of the renowned Kannada writer and Jnanapith Award winner Chandrasekhar Kambara's novel Karimaye, Seagull 2017, and Sivanna Dangura, Speaking Tiger in 2017. Krishna has received the 2019 Krishna Sahitya Academy Award for a translation of Karimaye, a translations of Dr. Kambara's two plays, Rishyashringa and Mohammad Gawan, has been published by Penguin Random House recently. Ma'am, it gives me immense pleasure to have you here today, and I must tell that I was stunned by Professor Krishna Manavalli's affable nature when I spoke to her over the phone. We spoke to her over the phone for the first time. It was so reassuring. Thank you, ma'am. And with these few words, I once again extend a cordial welcome to you, ma'am, and request you to kindly take over.
Abhiram? Okay. Good afternoon to you all. It really feels nice to be here. And after the very, very interesting and then exhaustive overview of theories that we have heard from my friend, Professor Vijay Sheshadri, I really think that I will only touch upon the major issues in post-colonial studies, and then we can move on to certain questions, queries, and issues that you might have. But to begin with, let me start talking about theory itself. Where have we come in literary theory today? I don't know. Actually, there was a time in the 20s when I went to the US there were these theory wars, theory, post-colonial theory, feminism, gender. Everything seemed so charged, and then everybody wanted to do theory. But now, having moved towards a different phase in literary studies and cultural studies, are we talking more about theory only? Are we talking about some kind of a theory wariness? This is something that we have to start discussing at one point or the other, because at the moment, where do we stand in terms of the relevance, importance of theory in our literary and cultural studies is a question that a lot of us have been asking. And talking about post-colonial theory, that's an interesting field. And as I said, in the like in the early 2000, 1990s, early 2000, those times, post-colonialism was one of the major theoretical perspectives that everybody was talking about in the US. And I'm sure you have known this. Usually the UK universities did not warm up to theory so much as the American universities did. American universities were all theory, and theory seemed to be one of the major thrusts of every course that was offered in the US. So I was there, and I started off with a post-colonial theory. And very soon, one of the things I noticed was, in order to call yourself a post-colonialist, the first thing that you have to do is start critiquing post-colonialism. That is one of the major central aspects of post-colonialism that I have found. I think that's good too, because it's always good to be self-critical, always good to be self-reflective. But that is something which has happened all through in the story of post-colonialism, and especially post-colonialism as it permeates from the central Western American academia into our own cultures, our own post-colonial nations. And we start asking the question, is post-colonial also an import from the West? This is one of the questions that a lot of critics have started asking. And let me give you an example. There was this extremely ironic, scathing kind of an attack of one of the important Marxist critics from the UK on another iconic post-colonial theorist, Spivak. And here is what he says. Deconstructionist, post-colonialist, feminist, Marxist, whatnot. So Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak wants to be in on all academic gains in the town. Is that what we're doing when we talk about theory? And especially something like post-colonialism, which is very interdisciplinary in nature. Interdisciplinary in terms of how it draws upon the other theories. You've been listening to Professor Vijay Sheshadri talking about the various theories, feminism, Marxism, and cultural studies, film theory, the language theories, deconstructionism, everything kind of becomes a part of what is seen as post-colonial theory. So post-colonial theory is in fact a very interdisciplinary field where you bring in theories from various other locations and you start talking about post-colonialism as a theoretical perspective in itself. Okay. And as I said, post-colonialism is a theoretical field which is full of contradictions, controversies. Perhaps that is what makes it very rich. To start with, let us look at the definitions of post-colonial theory. And you can see how contradictions and controversies begin even there. Okay. Let's look at some Yeah, sorry about that interruption. There are always tech snafus going on, so probably that's another post-colonial phenomenon. But anyways, going back to the idea of the timeline of post-colonial studies, that again has been a very, very problematic issue. When do you start looking at the impact of colonialism on colonized nations? So do we start looking at what happens to countries which have been colonized, lands and societies which have been colonized by the European powers after they become independent? So when you start talking about India as a post-colonial field, a post-colonial area as of study, so is it at the midnight in 1947 when the British said, okay, you're free now, good night and goodbye? But then when we talk about colonialism, it's not just what happens to colonies after they become independent. Colonialism is a phenomenon which leaves its scars and marks even after a colony becomes independent. And what led to colonialism in the first place? And what are the types of colonization we are talking about? Is it cultural colonization, where we, after all, we are all here talking English today? And isn't that a form of colonialism, or is it not? That's another question we have to ask. So when you talk about when colonialism began, what kind of colonialism? Is it political colonialism that we are talking about, so that decolonization or becoming independent is the marker of what is colonial and what is post-colonial? That's another problem which has always riddled this area of post-colonial studies. So what is the purview of post-colonial studies? Does it stretch from only after a colony becomes independent? Or do we talk about what led to colonialism in the first place? Yeah, post-colonialism has dealt with these aspects too. So when you talk about the British or the European colonization of India, then where do we start? Was it from the 16th century when their voyagers came into different lands, including ours, and then they started slowly penetrating into these spaces of Asia, these spaces of Africa? So do we say that the purview of post-colonial studies starts from early 16th century? Well, it could be so. And then where does it end, on the other hand? Are we talking about 1947 as the cutoff mark in history of post-colonialism when we talk about India? That again is problematic. Countries becoming independent does not ensure that they have moved away from the colonial impact. So then again, we are talking about what happens after the colony becomes independent, the aftermath of colonialism. And today, post-colonial studies has also drawn into itself another very, very broad area of neocolonialism. The contemporary neo-colonial context of the marginalization largely of the East by the West. And we talk about diaspora, we talk about globalization, we talk about the impact of the Western markets, the Western economic colonization of the South. It doesn't have to be a settler colony. It could be the Wall Street that is actually colonizing us down here in the non-European part of the world. So again, there is this problem of how colonialism is not just something which is talking about the actual settler colonies, and then it talking about the impact of just what happened because of the European powers coming and colonizing Africa and Asian countries. Today, we're talking about the neo-colonial context, the marginalization in economic terms. What happens when third world labor is being used in the West? What happens about the disparity of labor conditions? And what happens about the skilled diaspora moving into the heart of the Western metropolis? So these are all the questions that we have started asking. What happens to nations? What happens to national debts? And what is the meaning of the power of the West over the power of the East when we talk about the colonial impact or the neo-colonial impact? And this too comes under the purview of post-colonialism. So what exactly is the timeline? This is another question we have to ask. And then again, I'm asking too many questions, I know. But post-colonialism is a very rich and open field, and it has survived until now, despite all the onslaughts from people outside the post-colonial area and even people who call themselves post-colonial critics, only because of this openness, this ability to absorb new things into itself and new histories of the world into itself. Then we are talking about another view of the colonial. What is colonialism in terms of the metaphorical aspect? So should we talk about colonialism, as I said, of patriarchy or on women? Or where is colonialism situated or located? Is it just one different country coming and colonizing another country? Isn't there internal colonialism too? Look at what happens in terms of race within the US or within the European nations, and look at what happens in terms of class, caste, and gender. There are all kinds of hierarchies and marginalizations that you see in these areas. So isn't that a kind of an internal colonialism that we can see within the colonizer space or also within the space of the colonized? And how do we talk about internal colonialism? That seems to be the next question we have to address. And because of this very broad and very kind of in a chaotic or rather anarchic manner in which the definitions and the setting of timelines of post-colonial studies has happened, a lot of scholars have been worried about the trans-historic nature of this definition. Are the timelines unspecific? Is that good or bad? Is the question that we have to address at this point. And then again, I talked about the interdisciplinarity of post-colonial studies. So what do when we talk about interdisciplinarity? We basically look at the manner in which how a lot of post-colonial theory has drawn from postmodern theory, for instance, and post-structuralist theory. And of course, these interdisciplinary perspectives have been adopted from Freud, Marx, Lacan, Foucault, and Derrida. We've just heard about these great theorists and then the manner in which they talk about their own theoretical field. So I will not revisit that area again, but I'll just talk about the major ways in which post-colonialism has borrowed from these theorists. For example, the foundational text of post-colonialism, as everybody says, is Edward Said's Orientalism, which was written in the 70s. But then again, even in the 60s, there is an important work of Aimé Césaire, who writes a book, and he titles that book Discourse of Colonialism. So the Francophone world had already been talking about colonialism and then the impact of colonialism, but still the foundational text of post-colonial theory has always been recognized as Edward Said's Orientalism, which was written in the 70s. What is Said doing here, basically? He is, of course, drawing from major postmodern theorists like Foucault, for instance. He's talking about the major ideas of the West's production of knowledges about the East. And there you have Foucault's idea about the nexus between knowledge and power. How does the West perceive the East or construct the idea of the East or the Orient? And how does it construct this idea of the Orient in terms of certain stereotypes? East is exotic. East is prehistoric. East is opulent, rich. And there is also a spiritual East, because spirituality is something that you can find only in the East and not in the West that has been devastated by the wars. So what do? You go look for your spiritual self in the East. You can see that happening in any number of later modernist texts. Talk about anywhere from Hermann Hesse to somebody like Razor's Edge, Somerset Maugham. So you see this kind of stereotypes which become central in thinking about the East or the Orient. And this East or the Orient, which emerges in the West's imagination, is something that is formed not just by our literary types, not just by, no, you can't fault only the writers for that, literary writers for that. According to Said, there is a network of these texts, this textual network, where you can see political writers, you can see travel writers, you can see sociologists, you can see anthropologists. They all write about this Orient in a certain manner. And then the reader, of course, it's the reader from the West, the target reader here is the West, whose idea of the Orient or the East is followed by is completely defined by the manner in which these texts tell him what the Orient is. And he forms an idea, he or she forms an idea about the East or the Orient in a certain manner, and this gets disseminated in the further texts or the textual discourses which circulate all over the West. And sometimes it's very interesting to see how there is a reverse Orientalism. You can think of a lot of writers who actually espouse this idea of the Orient as a spiritual center. Look at Rajarav's writings, for instance. Of course, there is also a kind of a speaking back, a reversal that you see there, but there are certain of these stereotypes about the East as the place of spirituality, which impel these writings in the 60s that you see even from the colonies like India or the former colonies like India. Then these representations don't end. They are there, they're very much there even today. Just think about a very much more recent book like Eat, Pray and Love. Look at the sort of stereotypes that define the very title of that book. So you see, the Orientalization or the exotic Orient which emerges in the West imagination doesn't end when colonialism ends, European type colonialism ends, but we still go on representing the non-West or like the non-European lands in terms of these Orientalist ideas that we have borrowed from the 19th century, mostly from the 19th century, because that was the time when a lot of Orientalists went to different places in the East and started talking about the East. And this is, again, a problematic thing, because when you start thinking about the Orient in a certain manner, when you fix it in terms of certain stereotypes, what happens? The problem with the stereotype, of course, a stereotype is something which fixes you in a certain mold. You cannot go beyond that. So it's a kind of a static Orient that you see in the imagination of the West. And what's the problem there? It's static and it's constructed by the West so that it's the West which can have control over the idea of the East or the Orient. And the East or the Orient doesn't seem to have any power to define itself or to project itself differently in the eyes of the West. So this is a problem that is important in understanding the way in which the knowledge power nexus works in the textual discourses of the West, the colonialist texts and the manner in which they represent the Orient or the East. Another problem that you see here, again, let me go back to what I was talking about earlier, the nexus between culture and politics. Here, Syed is talking about how culture is not innocent of politics. Who were the people who invited the Orientalists? And very often, the Orientalists who came to India were funded by the East India Company. Why does this happen? And why is it that there was so much of ethnographic interest in India after 1857? Because the Sepoy Mutiny or the First War of Independence really scared the colonizer totally. This happened because at that time, the studies of the Indian local customs and traditions, or like the ethnographic studies, were not all that deep, but what happened during the Sepoy Mutiny or the Indian War of Independence was a flaw, a fault on the colonizer's part, because he did not understand what might happen if when he introduced this particular form of cartridge into Indian army. It was supposed to be laced with the lard of a pig, and then it enraged different religious communities which were a part of that army, and lo and behold, there was a huge revolution which started. So that was a time, as everybody is aware, that the jewel in the crown, or the India, was passed on to Victoria's hands. And that is also the time, interestingly, when ethnographic studies of India became so very, very important and central. How do you rule the East? You rule the East by knowing more about the East. What do you want to know about the East? You want to know how different the East is from you. And you want to know how the East is also inferior because it's different. And so this binarian sort of an idea of the East versus West, East as a bunch of stereotypes like exotic and the West as a norm. So if the East is prehistoric, the West becomes modern automatically in the imagination of the Western scholar. So these were the kind of stereotypes and knowledges produced about the Orient, which also helped in gaining political control. This is what Said was talking about. But of course, the Said of the early Orientalism is very different from the Said who writes his later works. Because at that time, Said also started talking about how the East is not a passive Orient, which is constructed completely by the West. What are the negotiations of the Eastern subjects, the Orientalist subjects, the Indians, for instance? How did they also participate, negotiate, and oppose these kinds of stereotypes which the West tried to heap on the Orient? Some of these things come through in his later works a lot. So there is some way in which he starts giving agency even to the Orient, and he starts talking about the negotiations of knowledges which involves the colonized spaces and the colonized peoples of the East in his later works. And another very important post-colonial theorist who was critical of Said's idea, although, of course, there are ways in which he also draws upon Said, but then he critiqued Said a lot too, was Homi Bhabha. Because here is Homi Bhabha, who is trying to move away from the idea of Orientalism or the West's construction of the East as a monolithic discourse. For Bhabha, the paradigm of the colonizer-colonized interactions is not just binarian. It's something beyond that. He is referring to the gray spaces where the colonizer and colonized divide breaks, and it gives way to a destabilization of both the identities. There is a lot of interaction going on between the colonized and the colonizer. There are negotiations, there are transactions. One of the things that he's talking about is mimicry, for instance. So what happens when the East mimics the West? Mimicry in itself is a form of resistance, according to Bhabha. And one of the examples that we can think of is Caliban's very famous answer to his colonizer, Prospero, in Shakespeare's Tempest. When Prospero asks Caliban, "I taught you the language, I civilized you," the answer that Caliban gives is, "I learned your language to curse you." There is always an element of irony involved in mimicry. So you learn English and you talk back to the colonizer in the same language that the colonizer gave us. So mimicry can also become a part of resistance. Another way in which mimicry becomes resistance is by questioning the idea of the West's superiority as something that is essential. An Englishman's superiority is not naturalized in the body of the Englishman. If somebody else, a non-Englishman, a non-white person, can mimic this man, then what happens to the essential Englishness? It's not resident in the body of the white Englishman anymore. So that is another question which mimicry raises. And these were some of the ideas which Homi Bhabha was talking about when he meant the questioning of the binarian vision of the East and the West within the colonial discourse. So he is all the time talking about the margins rather than the center. And in fact, the center and the margin are no longer binarian in Homi Bhabha's view. Then I'd like to very quickly move on to another theorist because we don't have a lot of time, and within the scope of this discussion, this talk, I cannot traverse in a slower pace and then look at every theorist in post-colonial studies in a really exhaustive manner. So let's look at another important post-colonial critic, post-colonial theorist, or post-colonial historian, John Muhammad, who again goes back to Baba and critiques him too. His problem with Baba is if you keep talking about the destabilization of the binaries, if you say that what happens because of the interaction between the colonizer and the colonized is all hybridity, then how do you marshal a political resistance? How do you marshal any resistance at all? And where are you talking about the relations of power? Because they continue here. What about the economic and political domination, which leaves a lasting impact on the post-colonial economies, for instance, and the post-colonial political organizations, which again seem to replicate the power structures of the West? So these are some of the questions like John Muhammad starts asking. He seems to follow Said and the earlier thinker Frantz Fanon a lot more than someone like Homi Bhabha. And for Frantz Fanon is another important post-colonial theorist. Theorist would be an interesting name to give to Fanon because Fanon was a lot of other things too. He was an activist, he was a psychiatrist who had hands-on experience of what colonialism does to not just the colonized bodies, but also the minds of people. And his Wretched of the Earth is not just a book which talks about the theory, history, or the philosophy of colonialism, but it's also something which deals with a whole bunch of case histories. There are very painful case histories here. For instance, he's talking about what happened to the colonized people in Algeria in terms of the psychological oppression and the psychological scars which colonialism left on them. And at the same time, he's also talking about what happens to the colonizer in Algeria, the French colonizers. So you have case studies like there is this young, very little child who has actually murdered a child who was his playmate. And then when asked why he did that, the answer is, but then he's black. And on the other hand, it seems there were also the policemen from the colonizers, of course, from within the colonizers' discourse, you also have the policemen who have tortured the rebels. They come to him too, and then they talk about how the tormenting or the tortures have left them psychologically damaged. They are the torturers, but then when they come back in the evenings, they feel the pain, they feel the weight of this on their own minds. So here is Fanon talking about not just what happens to the bodies. Of course, one of his books, Black Skin, White Moss, is a study of what happens to the body, the skin, as well as what happens to the mind. But Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist philosopher, is also talking about the damage that colonialism does to the minds of both the colonized and the colonizer. Then again, we have other theorists like A.J. Zalmat, who questions the culturalist bias of post-colonial studies and asks for more historicizing and more materialistic studies of the colonial discourse. So the themes which are important within the field of post-colonial studies, what you see in the background is the figure, of course, of Edward Said. So we talk about the colonial discourse, we talk about the power relations in colonial societies, and then nationalism, both in post-colonial nations, and how the colonial nations were affected by the colonies when they started gathering the colonies. How does the idea of nationalism begin changing? And what happens to the position of the colony within the European idea of the nation? And what happens to the post-colonial nations which form their own independent nations when they become independent? As a famous question asked by Chakravarti, you have this idea of, where did you get your idea of the nation? Was it always from Europe, always from the West? No, says Chakravarti. Here is a major question he asks. If you talk about nationalism or a nation as an imagined community, is our imagination also being colonized by the West? No, it's not so. We formed our own ideas of the nation. Yes, we borrowed some of the ideas from the West, but our own ideas of the nation, or at least the imaginings of the nation within the post-colonial countries, had to do so much with their own roots and the indigenous ideas and the particular histories in which these ideas of the nations were formed. And then again, there is the question of national culture. There are various ways in which the national culture becomes defined. So what happens when you talk about a national culture? Is it something that you see in terms of a pristine idea of culture which we had before the colonizer came? But how do you access that idea of culture again? Or do you talk about national culture in terms of Fanon, who is of national culture? What are the ideas of tradition? What are the ideas of culture? What are the ideas of indigeneity? And what are the ideas of roots that we form when we talk about national culture? Is another question that post-colonialism is talking about. And then, of course, as I said, post-colonialism is no longer talking about what happens after colonization or because of colonization to these nations which were colonized. It's also talking about globalization today. It's talking about global markets. So globalization, neo-colonialism, the new markets, liberalization, these are also the other concepts, the ideas which are being discussed in post-colonial studies today. And another issue which sort of straddles the colonial, post-colonial, and the neo-colonial times is that of identity formation. What are the identity formations in post-colonial countries in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of class, and in terms of sexuality? How has a colonizer impacted the idea of identity of a post-colonial subject, the colonized subject? So there is a lot about, I was referring to Fanon's black skin and white masks. What happens to you if you are a colonized person, if you are a person of marginalized race, gender, or class location, and then there is a colonizer who is constantly telling you that he is superior? So what do? Do you try to become the colonizer? Adaptation? Or do you try to oppose, like it happened in the Black radical movement, for instance, where Black becomes the concept of resistance, beauty within the Black radical movement, because it is something which is opposed to white. So how do you form your identity? Do you go back to your roots and say, this is my identity, and by embracing this identity, I oppose a colonizer? Or do you say, hey, look, I will be like you, but I cannot quite be like you? That is what the colonizer is all the time trying to do when he instills his own culture on you, but you can turn it into a form of resistance, as Baba talks about it. So what are the identities that are formed? For instance, think about diasporic identities. One of the things that colonialism did was to make the colonized person travel a lot. So migration became a very interesting and important phenomenon during colonial period and even after that. So what happens to the migrant identities? So how much of the migrant population takes from the cultures into which they have moved? How much of it do they want to preserve from the cultures and traditions that they have brought with them? What happens to first generation immigrants, first generation migrants who think that they have to bring their own cultures in order to find their own identities in the new spaces like America or European spaces they have moved into? You can see that a lot in the writings of the diasporic writers. They struggle with their identities. And then the second generation migrants who are more adapted into the cultures in which they were born, and then for whom their mother country might seem like another country. But then at the same time, there is always the space, the home space, which is trying to build an identity, a native identity for them. So there is all the struggle of identity formations, which you can see very, very importantly impelled by the colonial discourse. And of course, resistance, anti-colonialism, colonial language, French, English. What did we do with these languages? We say that it was imposed on us, and Gauri Vishwanathan's famous work, Masks of Conquest, talks about how British education and the English language was another important move of the colonizer to colonize us culturally. This is another mask of conquest in the name of civilizing us, in the name of giving us English, in the name of giving us a culture which is very superior, quote unquote, superior in the eyes of the colonizer. What happened actually? And Macaulay's infamous minutes tell us a lot about the perception of native cultures, native languages, and native knowledges in the eyes of the colonizer. We will give them English, says Macaulay, only to turn them into brown Englishmen, and then to make them our subordinates who can help us rule a country, but they can't quite become like us. So what happens to us when we become brown sahibs or the brown Englishmen? These were all the questions which came up with colonial culture, colonial education, colonial language being imposed on us. But the flip side of it is the manner in which we have used that to talk back to the colonizer. As I said, English became an important way of bringing the disparate peoples from different cultures, even within India, together in the anti-colonial movement starting from the 19th century. And with the colonial education, we started asking the questions, if these are the values you stand by, if you talk about equality, then why aren't we equal? If you talk about humanism, aren't we human too? These are some of the questions that colonialism, in the manner in which it tried to impose education, its education on us, also sort of boomeranged, and we started using it as an anti-colonial move. Okay. Much time to have? 10 minutes? Okay. So I'll quickly move through the important aspects of post-colonialism. One of the important aspects of post-colonialism is post-colonial feminism. And there was a question in the earlier session which brought up this issue. And as Professor Vijay rightly points out, gender is a construct in a very, very different context, colonial or post-colonial. But when we talk about feminism, then there is a way in which we can talk about the post-colonial feminists trying to question the feminism which came from the West. Gender is a construct which is the same across the board, perhaps, but our idea of feminism and the manner in which we talk about feminism in the post-colonial nations is certainly very, very different. And you can think about third world women who are doubly marginalized because they're marginalized by both the colonial patriarchies and the native patriarchies. So their histories of resistance and oppression are very different from the histories of resistance and oppression of, say, the Western women. Again, homogenizing all Western women could be a very, very problematic move. But for convenience sake, I'm talking about how the disparate histories of the colonized countries also impact the manner in which feminism becomes formed within these countries. And a lot of post-colonial feminists, like for instance Spivak or Chandra Mohanty, in fact her book is titled Under Western Eyes, or people like Gloria Anzaldúa, talks about how the idea of white feminism or the dominant form of feminism tries to homogenize women all over the globe. And what are they doing here? they're talking about how all women are the same and all women are oppressed in a similar manner. Then what happens to the particular histories of resistance of women from post-colonial nations? What happens to their different histories of oppression? Are you going to erase them, eliminate them, and only talk about the idea of woman as monolithic? This was a question which Chandra Mohanty was asking. In fact, she prefers the term women rather than woman because woman seems to be such a homogenizing term where the white woman thinks that she is the savior of all these other non-white women. And that is the reason why you have certain feminist theories which have emerged from the other side of the colonizer divide, where you have people like Gloria Anzaldúa talking about borderlands or the mestiza consciousness, where she uses multiple languages, multiple identities to understand what is happening to women who try to move across the Mexican border, or like the borders of the white and the non-white and the hybrid identities of these women. And then we have Chandra Mohanty, who's talking about the women from the Asian and the non-Western nations and their very different histories. And then, as I said, there is Black feminism, which talks about how a Black woman is hardly seen as a woman and also a Black person. So why is it that the privileges that the white women enjoy are not given to Black women? This was a question which a very early abolitionist, you can call her feminist too, activist Sojourner Truth asked even in the 19th century. She says, I'm a Black woman, but I'm not given the same privileges that a white woman is given. So am I the same? Ain't I a woman too? From there on, you have a lot of Black feminists like Bell Hooks and Alice Walker who talks about womanism instead of feminism, and or Patricia Hill Collins who says that you really have to talk about race and class before you talk about gender, because they're all fields, they're all identities which are connected. Then we have post-colonial literature. What is post-colonial literature is a question that again becomes problematic. So is it only the literature written by the colonized or the formerly colonized people? But when we do post-colonial literature, we also look at the text of the colonizer. For instance, I talk about Jane Eyre. Why? Because here we find the representations, certain way in which the colonized become represented in the master texts of Europe or the English text. How does Charlotte Bronte represent the non-Western people, Indians, for instance? How does Wilkie Collins look at the Indians in his Moonstone, for instance? So or what does Anglo-Indian writing? It has become a new genre in itself now. What happens in these master texts of the West when they start talking about the colonized people? So these are the questions we ask in post-colonial literature. So we also read the master texts or the European text to look at how the colonized are represented in these texts, or how the colonized spaces are represented in these texts. And then, of course, post-colonial literature is a literature which is not only something that is anti-colonial, but it also resists the colonizer in different ways and in different voices. That is a reason why post-colonial writers like anywhere from Marquez to Rushdie to Ondaatje, they have also started using the hybrid voices. They have started using new ways of representing the realities of the colonized peoples or the formerly colonized peoples. They reject the realism of the West, for instance, and they go to the magic realist mode. On the other hand, there is Achebe, who writes a completely anti-colonial, very early anti-colonial work like Things Fall Apart, to show that before the colonizer came, there was culture in Africa. And then another field, which is a subfield of post-colonial studies, is subaltern studies. Spivak, Ranjit Guha, and others who talk about the subaltern, as a particular subject who has been oppressed, yes, but not all post-colonial subjects are subaltern subjects. Like Spivak famously says, anybody who cannot get a piece of the pie is not a subaltern. A subaltern is somebody who is oppressed at multiple levels and who has no access to cultural hegemony. Hegemony is an idea which comes from Gramsci. Gramsci talks about two ways of dominating, two ways of controlling. One is domination, which may be brutal domination, but on the other hand, hegemony is the way in which you try to dominate by the consent of the dominated. So subaltern studies talks about people who are under the cultural hegemony at multiple levels. Women, for instance, tribals, and then people at the lowest rung who are marginalized in various ways. And according to Spivak, her famous work, which has raised a lot of controversy, Can the Subaltern Speak? There is no way in which the subaltern can speak the same language that the oppressor speaks. Okay. And again, to sum up the controversies, here are some of them. Yeah, I've talked a lot more about controversies. Yes, I think but that is important in understanding what post-colonial studies as a field tells us today. So is it transhistoric in terms of its timelines? When do you start talking? Is there a time period or a timeline in which you place post-colonial studies? Then can you homogenize what happened in different post-colonial spaces? Was it always, there could be similarities, but was African countries colonized in Africa as a continent? Come on. So was African countries colonized in a similar manner like Asian, Indian spaces were? So these are the questions it raises when you talk about post-colonial studies. But of course, there are very, very nuanced studies which are coming up with this very strong historicist approach, and then the problem of the terms, then the culturalist bias, and the obscurantism. Of course, you know, some of the post-colonial writers like Baba, he was given the award for the worst kind of writing in the world, which of course is perhaps reductive, very, very reductive. But then the problem here was nobody seems to understand the way that they write. There is so much of obscurantism. For example, here is a line: the inchoate infant's aboriginal para-subject cannot be theorized as functionally completely frozen in a world where teleology is thematized into geography. Spivak's line. What do you understand? If you're talking about an oppressed subject, and if you want to reach those oppressed people, who can understand this language except the privileged academics, is a question that is being asked. So when does post-colonial studies move out of the academia and touch the people outside, the society outside? That is another criticism of post-colonial studies. And then how much of internal colonialism does post-colonial studies address? This is the question that we have to look at. And this is something that I've already talked about, the new trends in post-colonial studies. But of course, these are already trends which have become entrenched in the academies and outside the academies. And so how new are they is another question. Post-colonial studies is talking about diaspora. And in fact, the term that we use more today is diaspora studies, or come a little further, you're talking about global literatures when you talk about literatures, and now new literatures. So how far are we moving away from the very term post-colonial studies is another question that we have to ask. And I think with this, I will end my talk. Of course, there are more questions here than answers, but I think that provides a rich field for discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Can we take a few questions?
Sure.
Ma'am, this
Okay.
Ma'am, this question is from Kavya Shri. If colonialism and post-colonialism are hybridized, then what is the end product?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
If colonialism and post-colonialism are hybridized, then
Hybridized.
Then what is the end product? Kavya Shri poses this question.
This hybridization is something that is a very problematic term, as I already pointed out. And I sort of moved through the history of this term. In a way, we start looking at the binarian manner in which early side, not the side of culture and imperialism. The later side is very, very nuanced in his study of the colonizer-colonized binary, because he's already talking about the negotiations. He's already talking about the resistance of the colonized people, and it's no longer like a passive Orient that he sees there. Now, when we move to somebody like Baba or Spivak, we are talking about this sort of hybridity, especially in terms of the Babaist idea of the colonized subject, or the formerly colonized subject, or even the post-colonial subject. So the question here is, how do you look at the notion of hybridity itself? Hybridity is a notion which post-colonialism, which is a very interdisciplinary field, has perhaps taken from the postmodern notion of rejecting anything essentialist. And I would really recommend reading this marvelous article by Kumkum Sangari, where the title itself is interesting. She talks about the politics of the possible. So if you're going to talk about non-essentialism, if you're all the time talking about hybridity or like the non-essentialist approach, then how do you marshal your political opposition or political resistance? Of course, Spivak has a very clever answer where she's talking about strategic essentialism, where you still think about essentialism as a very temporary phenomenon to marshal your resistance. But then beyond that, you give up your essentialist kind of framework. So hybridity, as I said, can work two ways. One of the problems of thinking about hybridity is forgetting that there is political oppression and there are oppressors and there is the oppressed. But on the other hand, the idea of hybridity is important because it questions the notion of a passive colonized. The colonized have always resisted in various ways. It could be in small ways, but there has been resistance. And the example I gave was that of mimicry. The moment you mimic someone, you're also being ironic of the person you're mimicking. So hybridity can be, potentially resistant on the one hand. On the other hand, if you take it too far, it can also dismantle the notion of any resistance, because there is no essential core from which that resistance can spring from. So it cuts both ways.
This question is from Sanjita Gauri Shankar. Is it safe to say capitalism is the new colonization? She has three questions, in fact. If this is the first one. Second one, in a country like India, where there is a clash of diverse cultures, the question of a single national identity becomes very difficult to address. How should one go about that, especially in the current political climate?
Well, these are three different questions in a way. To start with, there have been a lot of criticism about looking at colonialism as a parallel to the history of capitalism, because that would be very reductive in terms of looking at the idea of colonialism in post-colonial nations as something which can be predicated only on the history of the capital. So it's very problematic, as Spivak herself very famously talks about in even a very early work like Can the Subaltern Speak? Who are the proletariat? Is this idea of the working class a homogeneous idea? So that is where she starts her. I have problems with her reading too, but talking about the history of colonialism or the post-colonial history only in terms of the history of the capital would be very, very reductive. That is one problem that we have. And moving on to the next question. What was the question again? I'm sorry, it was a very different question, right?
I'll come. In a country where there is a clash of diverse cultures, the question of a single national identity becomes very difficult to address. How should one go about that, especially in the current political climate?
When you talk about national identities, One of the things that we can think about here is again Baba. Baba's idea of the nation or national culture or the national space is always something that emerges from the margins. In fact, what he's trying to do here in his nation, and where he's talking about the nation itself as something which is formed by this, it's not even a dialectic, it's like a hybrid space where you're talking about the center and the margin as almost collapsing. Yeah, there are diverse cultures, and we're talking about multiculturalism, which is of course another concept, because that sometimes comes from the multiculturalist idea where you see the dominant culture as the center and all the other cultures as something on the periphery. And when you look at the other cultures, they have to be looked at in terms of the central culture. Is that what is happening in America? Is a question that we have asked time and again in post-colonial studies. But then a respect for diversity, a respect for differences. After all, difference is something that you have to acknowledge and also respect. So perhaps that is a way to go about, and that is a way to go about forming a national identity. A nation is certainly not a homogeneous space. Nation has always been a space of heterogeneity. It could be not only in terms of culture, it could be in terms of other identities too. Gender, class, right? It's always a very heterogeneous space. So when you talk about a nation, of course, I mean, this diversity is also something which makes that idea a lot more vibrant and rich and plural.
One more question. Why do most colleges in India pander only to the Western concept of feminism, but rarely address intersectional feminism within our own community?
Within our
Own communities.
communities. Uh, can she talk what exactly she means by our own communities? Are we talking about Indian feminism, or are we talking about or something much more localized? But if you're talking about Indian feminism, I already addressed that question. There is a necessity to talk about post-colonial feminisms, and pluralizing the term feminism is in itself a very, very resistant move. There is no longer a single idea of feminism. There is what is very, very ironically called white feminism. No, I talked about black feminism, Indian feminism. I talked about the Indian feminists, Indian post-colonial feminists. I think we should have them more in our curriculum. But I do see, I look at, of course, a lot of like the PG context. I don't know how much of it happens in the undergraduate context, but I think in the academia at the level of the master's degrees and the doctoral degrees, I see any number of students writing, especially, no, I shouldn't be saying only female students. Feminism is nothing that is biological. There are a lot of students who are talking about feminist issues in India, and certainly they're addressing these issues in the eyes of Indian feminists. Chandra Mohanty, Spivak, a lot of these theorists are being talked about in those contexts. Probably it's important to introduce them at a very, very early stages in their reading of feminism. I think it's important, even probably from the undergraduate level. May not be Spivak, but at least somebody like Chandra Mohanty, whose ideas are a lot more accessible and whose language too seems a lot more accessible.
This question is from Raj Muthu. Can post-feminism be considered as the best solution right now for gender role/performance and binary thinking?
I didn't get it.
Can post-feminism be considered as the best solution right now for gender role or performance and binary thinking?
I'm really, a little skeptical about the term post itself. What is post? Because now today we are talking about postmodernism. We're talking about post feminism. So I don't know, the questions which were raised very, very early when we talked about ambivalence. Baba talks about ambivalence, for instance, or people even in the third wave of feminism talked about these questions already, right? They talked about gender as rather a range of identities rather than a singular identity. So I guess, yeah, certainly, yes, because from the third wave feminism onwards, we've started asking these questions about breaking very strict gender identities and also questioning the notions of sexual orientation. Yeah, today we have any number of courses and even programs, especially in the Western academia, which deal with these issues. Certainly, yes, of sexual orientation or gender identities. Certainly, yes, in a very, very nuanced forms.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome. Thank you. It felt. I guess it made you think, and it made me think too. Maybe when I come and talk to you next time, I can give you more answers. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your presentation, providing an overall view, tracing its origin, touching upon the major theorists and themes to the recent trends. Now I request Ms. Geeta, faculty member, to propose vote of thanks.
Good afternoon. I must express my sincere apologies for repeatedly coming on screen. But it has become little unavoidable as my department colleagues could not be here due to unavoidable circumstances. But I would be failing in my duty if I do not express my sense of gratitude. At the outset, I express my sincere gratitude to Professor Vijay Sheshadri for being the resource person today and providing a comprehensive picture of modern literary theories. It's not easy to bring so many concepts in a talk spanning an hour and a few minutes. Sir, thank you for providing a bird's eye view, and I'm sure that the English teaching fraternity will find themselves on a more comfortable terrain as far as literary theories are concerned. Sir, a word of gratitude for standing by the department and guiding us while we planned and executed a meaningful program. Thank you, sir. I express my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Krishna Manavalli for the talk on post-colonialism. The area of theories is vast. A one-day program cannot do complete justice. Yet the talks today put behind the constraint of time. Madam, thank you for the presentation, putting in a nutshell what post-colonialism is. Your talk provided the direction in which one should read more. Thank you, ma'am, and I'm humbled by your simplicity, modesty, and friendly nature. Thank you, ma'am. Any program cannot be labeled successful until we have a good number of participants, not only in number, but by adding value to it by their discussions. Today, we have more than 200 participants taking part in this webinar, and a few meaningful questions raised by you has certainly added value to this webinar. I thank all the participants without whom the webinar could have not been a success. In fact, today we had 200 in number from various states like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra, Telangana, Maharashtra, Delhi, and even from far off Assam. Thank you once again. I take this opportunity to thank Srimati Purnima, who has been of immense help all these days and stepping in at the last moment to be the master of ceremony. Thank you, Purnima madam. I also thank the technical team led by Mr. Manjunath, Karthik, and Ashok. Thank you, sirs, for wonderful cooperation. I remember with gratitude the management and our principal, Dr. B.R. Jaikumari, for their unflinching support. I also thank my department colleagues, head of the department, Mr. Manjunath, and Dr. Indrani M.R. in their absence. I thank the head of the Department of Journalism, Mr. Ravi Iyer, for providing the studio facility. I thank Mr. Marigowda, the supervisor, for ensuring the safety measures, and Mr. Ningegowda for photography. Thank you all. Continue to stay safe. Thank you once again.
I once again thank all the participants wholeheartedly for your active participation in the national level webinar. Please fill in the feedback form. The link will be available only for 45 minutes. E-certificates will be issued to only those who have submitted the form. Thank you one and all.